Chapter 27 of Paul the Dauntless. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by David Leeson. Paul the Dauntless by Basil Joseph Mathews. Chapter 27. The Foiled Plot. As the ship clove her way northward through the wintry waves of the Aegean Sea, Paul's own heart was grey and stormy. The riot at Ephesus had broken his work for the time, work that was more to him than life. As he looked back he could see that the more wonderful his success became, the hotter was the fury against him of those who stood for the old ways. Thrust out of Pisidian Antioch and Iconium, stoned in Lystra, beaten and imprisoned in Philippi, threatened with death in Thessalonica, scorned at Athens, dragged before the proconsul in Corinth, and now howled at by tens of thousands of Ephesians. Paul knew that he, like his master, must expect death if he was to run the straight race in defiance of all. But on this Paul the Dauntless had long made up his mind. " I am ready," he said, " to be slain for Christ's sake." He had shown also a score of times, in face of deadly peril, that what he said he was ready to do. The ship at sunset swung round the jutting headland and sailed into the great harbour of Troas. The city behind looked from its hillside over the sea. Paul again saw the dawn come up over those immortal mountains which had looked down on the fights of Achilles and Hector and all the heroes of the Trojan wars. There in Troas he waited for a time with some of his friends who lived there. He had thought that there he might meet one of his closest comrades, Titus, the brave Greek who was on the way back from Corinth with the reply to a letter (our 1 Corinthians or another) that Paul had written from Ephesus, and as to the effect of which he was in great anxiety. But to his disappointment Titus had not yet returned. " At Troas," writes Paul, " I could not rest, because I found not Titus my brother. So I said goodbye and went off to Macedonia." Going aboard another ship, Paul sailed northwest across the narrow seas past Samothrace Island, and once more made the harbour of Neapolis. As he looked up from the harbour toward the city of Philippi on the heights behind the Macedonian coast, he could not but remember the strange adventure of the rods, the prison, and the earthquake. We do not know what happened on this occasion when he reached Philippi. We only know that winter was still in his heart. " When I reached Macedonia," he confided later to his friends in Corinth, " it was trouble at every turn, wrangling all round me, fears in my own mind." Then there came to him a sight and the sound of news that wreathed his face with smiles and made his heart dance. He saw a figure coming toward him, his brave, buoyant comrade, Titus, with glad news from Corinth that the people there had received his letter in a good spirit and had repented of their quarrels and their light thoughts about deeds of lust. Titus told Paul how delighted he was with the Christians at Corinth, how they had received him with great respect, and did all the things that he told them. As Paul wrote to them later on in that same spring, " I am indeed proud of you. You are a perfect comfort to me. I am overflowing with delight amid all the trouble I have to bear. Titus gave me such a report of how you longed for me, how sorry you were, and how eagerly you took my part, that it filled me with joy. I told Titus of my pride in you, and have not been put to shame. I am glad to have full confidence in you." But there was still a cloud on the sky which needed clearing away. Some men there were who questioned Paul's authority to write to them, telling them how to behave and to live as Christians. They were largely egged on by certain interloping Judaizers from Judea, who styled themselves apostles and denied the title to Paul. " Who is this Paul after all? " they asked. Paul put forward in reply a claim that indeed must have made those " very eminent apostles," as he calls them in irony, wince, when they came to ask whether they had ever done anything that touched the dauntless courage of Paul. He asks are these critics of his really ministers of Christ, and replies, " Yes, but not as much as I am, with all my labours, with all my lashes, with all my time in prison, a record longer far than theirs. I have been often at the point of death. 5 times have I got 40 lashes, all but one, from the Jews. 3 times have I been beaten by the Romans, once pelted with stones. 3 times shipwrecked, adrift at sea for a whole night and day. I have been often on my travels. I have been in danger from rivers and robbers, in danger from Jews and Gentiles, through dangers of town and desert, through dangers on the sea, through dangers among false brothers, through labor and hardship, through many a sleepless night, through hunger and thirst, starving many a time, cold and ill-clad, and all the rest of it." Then Paul told how the brethren at Philippi were getting together a gift for the poor at Jerusalem, and how he was asking Titus to return with this letter to Corinth and stir them up to do the same at once, for he wished a year hence to go on to Jerusalem, with delegates from Achaia, Macedonia, Asia, and Galatia bearing the gift. This was what he had been aiming at ever since he had left Jerusalem, nearly 3 years before. While Titus was hurrying back to Corinth, Paul spent the whole of that spring and summer first in Philippi, then going along the Roman road to Thessalonica, and in the autumn he reached Beroea. He was not alone now, for before Titus left, his own loved Timothy had joined him in time to share in the letter Titus was to carry back. Titus probably returned from there before Paul left Ephesus. When winter came on, Paul went southward from Beroea, and sailing up the gulf past Piraeus, he landed at the port of Cenchrea and once more walked in the busy streets of Corinth. During that winter spent in Corinth, the last of his mission work in Greece, Paul wrote the greatest of his epistles, that to the as yet unvisited church in Rome. Paul was proud to say, "I am a Roman citizen, free born." Young Nero was on the throne of the empire, but he had not yet shown himself to be the bloodthirsty, boasting, unnatural monster that he later became. Paul knew that it was the wonderful Pax Romana that gave him safe passage across the seas and along those Roman roads which linked the whole empire together from Damascus to the Pillars of Hercules, and from Tarsus even to London. It was more and more burning itself in on Paul's mind that all roads lead to Rome. "I must see Rome," he said, and what is more, he had made up his mind to press on, beyond Rome, even into Spain. As Paul had sat through those mornings in Corinth and Ephesus, sewing and weaving to earn his own living, Aquila, at work alongside him, would talk of the greatness of Rome and of the men and women there who had already gathered together into a Christian church. Some of them were friends of Paul, such as Epaenetus, who had gone to Rome from Asia. There were in the church at Rome his kinsmen in the flesh, probably fellow Jews, Andronicus, Junius, and Herodion, and young men like Rufus, with dear old women like Rufus's mother, "his mother and mine," as Paul affectionately calls her. Paul wished to help all those people in Rome to glory in the greatness of their faith, and to forget, in one burning flame of love for Jesus Christ and for one another, everything that divided them. Through more than one winter day then, when even the waters of the narrow Gulf of Corinth were whipped to rage by the gales that tore down from the snow-covered heights to the north, Paul, in the house of his friend Gaius, dictated to young Tertius a long letter to the Romans. Tertius's reed pen scratched and moved on the parchment as Paul, his eyes glowing with concentrated fire of brain and heart, spoke high and deep thoughts that make this letter not easy to understand when we first read it, yet thoughts that have made a difference to the world ever since. And although the letter was so lofty, Paul took up many lines of writing at the end sending his greetings to his friends, each one by name. Probably his friend Phoebe of Cenchrea carried this letter to Rome, where she now lived. At last the long winter was over. The anemones began to spring through the brown earth and the swallows to come back from Egypt. The collection that had been made in the churches all around the Aegean Sea and up on the plateaus was being brought to one place, so that Paul and his friends could together carry the gift to Jerusalem. Paul had arranged to go by a pilgrim ship to Jerusalem, picking up the others on the way, so that they might arrive in time for the feast. One night, however, a friend came to Gaius's house with a startling rumour. The strict Jews, who had never forgiven Paul for going over from the Pharisees to the side of Christ, and who saw in him the great enemy, had worked out a plot for killing him on the journey. They hoped, perhaps, on the Great Sea, to have him stabbed in the night and his body dropped overboard. Paul never flinched from danger, but death at that hour would ruin all his scheme for taking the gift to Jerusalem and going on thence to Rome. Slowly he changed his plans. He arranged with his friends to meet them in Troas in the second week in April, en route for Jerusalem. He himself took journey through northern Greece. His enemies were foiled. Paul celebrated the Passover with his friend Luke and a number of the others at Philippi. Then they got on board another ship at the port, Neapolis, in the following week. The winds were contrary, for it took 5 days to cross from Neapolis to Troas, a 2 days' run. There they met their friends with whom they were to sail for Jerusalem. The whole group of friends was made up, in addition to Paul their leader and Luke, of Sopater, the son of Pyrrhus, who had travelled from Berea, and his Macedonian friend Aristarchus, representing Thessalonica; Gaius from Derbe with Timothy of Lystra, representing the churches up on the plateau of Galatia, while the province of Asia sent Tychicus and Trophimus. Paul and his company stayed for a whole week at Troas. Paul, having been prevented from reaching Jerusalem for the Passover, which he had now celebrated in Philippi, was determined to reach Jerusalem for Pentecost, our Whitsuntide. Pentecost fell that year (57) on May 28, and, as Passover week began on April 7, it was April 19 when Paul reached Troas. He had just under 6 weeks in which to cover the journey down the Aegean Sea, across the Great Sea to Caesarea, and on foot to Jerusalem. He found, as the week wore on at Troas, a ship that was taking a coasting journey with cargo down the coast of Asia and round past Rhodes to Patara, where he was sure to find a ship sailing eastward. The ship would not run into the Gulf of Ephesus, but would wait for some days at Miletus beyond the Gulf to discharge and take up cargo. This would give Paul an opportunity for saying farewell to his close friends of Ephesus. He therefore decided to go aboard that ship. Paul with his friends, on the last day of their stay in Troas, on the first day of the week, April 25, went together to a large house 3 stories high. Going up by the stone stairs outside the house they opened the door of a large room at the top of the building where they could, undisturbed and uncrowded, hear the great leader, the fame of whose work and adventure in many lands and on the waters was known to them all. The evening waned. As the swift darkness came on, servants brought little lamps, and soon the flickering lights from many wicks cast soft lights and shadows over the thoughtful faces of those who listened while Paul spoke to them. The stars came out. The night wore on. It was midnight. And still Paul, full of the glory and wonder of the story of God's power and love and holiness shown in Jesus Christ, spoke on. And still the people, lost to all thought of time, listened. A lad, Eutychus, sat on the window sill, gazing long with reverence at the daring pioneer, who stood there with glowing face and with hands gnarled with work, the hero of 100 adventures in travel. But now midnight was past. Eutychus was very tired. He drowsed and nodded and then fell fast asleep. He drooped perilously in the window. Suddenly there was the sound of a cry and sickening thud. Eutychus had overbalanced and had fallen headlong from the window 3 stories high. He lay on the ground in the dim starlight, horribly still and white. Paul and Luke rushed down. Luke, the physician, looked for breathing or heartbeat. He was sure that the young man was dead. The others gathered round, their faces and voices full of sorrow. Paul threw himself down and held the body close to the warmth and the breathing of his own body. " Do not lament," he said. " The life is still in him." Paul went upstairs again to the room where the Christians of Troas were waiting. Then, long before dawn, he broke bread and, with the others, ate it, and drank from the cup together in memory of their Lord. Paul had already 2 years before, when writing from Ephesus to the people at Corinth, said what was in his mind when he taught them in every place to join in this sacred meal. " I passed on to you," he wrote, " what I received as from the Lord Himself, namely, that on the night He was betrayed the Lord Jesus took a loaf, and after thanking God He broke it, saying, ' This means my body broken for you. Do this in memory of me.' In the same way he took the cup after supper, saying, 'This means the new covenant ratified in my blood. As often as you drink it, do it in memory of me. For as often as you eat this loaf and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he come.'" Paul, when they had broken bread, continued his talk with his friends till the first faint light of dawn from beyond Mount Ida beyond Troas dimmed the light of the lamps. By this time the lad, Eutychus, had recovered consciousness, though the shock still made it impossible for him to walk. But his friends were greatly relieved to be able to carry him home alive. Meantime Luke, with Aristarchus and the others, had gone down to the harbour, and had before dawn gone aboard the ship, which was obliged to make an early start to take advantage of the morning breeze from the north. When the morning came they were already out on the sea with the bows of their ship rounding the cape on the way to Assos. So Paul, just as he was, not waiting for sleep or rest, went out on the road in the dawning light with resolute face, to join the ship of adventure which was to carry him where his enemies thronged. End of chapter 27.